This video serves as a module summary and wrap up for the Create a High Performance Learning Culture module, one in a series of leadership development modules designed to address the 5 pivotal practices of learning-centered leaders identified by the DeKalb County Schools Leadership Development Department. As we summarize and wrap up the Create a High Performance Learning Culture module, we want to just look quickly at how this module fits into the framework for leadership development in DeKalb County. DeKalb County School District's leadership vision is transforming leaders into extraordinary performers. The 5 pivotal practices of learning-centered leaders identified by the DeKalb Leadership Development Department include shape a vision for academic success, create a high-performance learning culture, the module that we're wrapping up in this video, cultivate leaders in others, improve instruction, and manage people, data, and processes. So as we have worked with the Create a High Performance Learning Culture module, we have really looked at the 3 key concepts that define this particular pivotal practice. The essential questions that frame the learning outcomes for this particular module have been informed by the emphasis on a need for high-performance learning cultures in schools in order to achieve excellence, success, equity, all the things we aspire to with and for our schools. These 3 essential questions include what is a high-performance learning culture, which we really worked on during the first 2 virtual sessions in this module experience. And then the second and third question really relate together. How can leaders determine current reality of school culture? That was done in consort with how can leaders guide a shift from current reality to create a high-performance learning culture. And we did these 2 learning outcomes together because we recognize that when you are looking at examining what is in the current reality in consort with concepts and skills included in this module, you're able to both assess the current reality, identify the gaps, and then use the leadership practices learned about creating a high-performance learning culture to make that shift in your school. Leaders seeking to create a high-performance learning culture in the context of schools have to address these 3 organizational dimensions. The conditions, these are cultural requisites for high-performance learning cultures. These are specific features of the organizational or school culture that are essential for learning and engagement. Functions, these are the processes that reflect the work that is to be done, and structures. This is how time, space, and interactions are organized. We started this module with a focus on conditions, and there are 3 conditions that we investigated and looked deeply at that really are the cultural prerequisites for high-performance learning. They are inclusiveness based on trust and respect, a shared commitment to learning throughout the organization, and a collective sense of mutual accountability throughout the organization. Now, as we review what we talked about with each of this, we may be reminded that inclusiveness requires each member of a learning community to perceive that they are trusted and contribute to the mutual trust and respect that is essential for high-performance learning. While a level of professional competence in all areas of instructional practices, curriculum, instruction, and assessment, as well as classroom management is important, this commitment to continued learning, growth, and development as a collective enterprise in the school must be embedded in the professional culture of the school. Finally, mutual accountability for the success of each student is the 3rd feature essential for high-performance learning culture. When we dug into the first condition's inclusiveness, we looked at really defining trust, because inclusiveness based on trust and respect means that we have to look at both of these. We looked at Pat Lencioni's work in the 5 Dysfunction of Teams when he said members of great teams trust one another on a fundamental emotional level. They are comfortable being vulnerable with one another about their strengths, weaknesses, mistakes, fears, and behaviors. But trust really is this continuum, and we talked about the look-fors that helped us identify that we were moving toward vulnerability-based trust. We also looked at this notion of inclusiveness with asking what is respect and clarifying that being respected doesn't mean that when you say something you get your way, but it does mean that your ideas and needs are affirmed whether they can be immediately addressed or not. There are so many things to think about with trust and respect. And after we looked at these notions of trust and respect as a foundation for inclusiveness, we also identified some look-fors so we could define what it would look like in action if we had achieved that condition of inclusiveness based on trust and respect. The second condition is that learning-oriented leadership idea of a commitment to learning. See, the challenges that we face in our schools and that you all face on a day-to-day basis as principals is that we don't necessarily have answers to the challenges, which is what makes them adaptive. And it demands the type of leadership and this condition that is cultivated to prioritize the adult development so that all educators can better manage the complexity of work today. The final condition of a high-performance learning culture is that mutual accountability exists. And when we look at the difference between traditional accountability, which is really in the green arrow there, unilateral or traditional accountability is the result of a formal evaluation system where others are evaluating work that you have done. But a view of mutual accountability takes into account the interdependent work of teams that is required in order to be able to move forward at a level of high performance. Because team members are involved in each other's activities and see immediately the results that others' efforts have on their shared goals, team members are ideally positioned to mutually hold one another accountable for team progress and team outcomes. So as we wrapped up our learning and discussions and application activities with these conditions, these cultural prerequisites for high-performance learning cultures, you all identified conditions look-fors. So you, for each of the 3 conditions, inclusiveness based on trust and respect, commitment to learning, and mutual accountability, we asked you to record specific behaviors that you would want to see or experience when that condition is met among a team that you lead in your school. We also challenged you to think about other teams in the school, maybe that members of your leadership team lead, or department and grade level teams, goal teams. What would that each condition look like in action with them? Once we're really clear about the cultural prerequisite conditions, then we can talk about the work that happens among groups in high-performance learning cultures, right? These are the functions. The functions are the work that you do to accomplish your goal. And the 3 functions that we investigated in this module for high-performance learning were deprivatization of practice, reflective dialogue, and collaborative work. When we talked about deprivatization of practice, we revisited this very accurate image of silos and how silos really can unintentionally create very hard boundaries between groups. So how do we deconstruct those silos with authentic deprivatization of practice? In our conversations about this, we looked at multiple protocols and examples of ways that folks could be engaged in truly deprivatizing their practice. And we identified, much like you can see on this slide, we identified that true deprivatization of practice happens when teachers are sharing their work with other teachers and getting the feedback to fine-tune their work, or teachers are collaboratively examining all the student work produced during a particular activity or a narrow time period by some of their own students collectively, right? A collaborative assessment conference could be structured for teachers to share student work from their classroom assessment with others who then examine it and focus on giving feedback to the task. That's deprivatization of practice done by the teachers for the teachers, not feedback given to teachers by others who were not part of a collaborative conversation. Also in the functions is this notion of reflective dialogue and reflective engagement, and the importance of going beyond just conversations about work, but to that engagement of reflection. We looked at the levels of reflective dialogue, moving from unawareness, where we're not really even asking questions or identifying critical incidents, to noticing some things, to making sense, making meaning, and ultimately to dialogue that is truly transformative, meaning that it results in restructured learning, and as we'll see later on, contributes to a much higher level of collaborative work. In collaborative work, we linked this back to those requisite cultural conditions of trust, and we noticed that the reflective dialogue, reflection and dialogue, serve as an early low continuum form of collaborative work, all the way through looking at collaboratively reviewing work, parallel working with one another, the sequential work that we talked about, and ultimately to that synergy. And again, just like with the cultural recognitions for the functions, we challenge you to look at how deprivatization of practice shows up in teams that you lead, or what it would look like if it showed up in teams that you lead. Reflective dialogue and collaborative work, we wanted you to identify those look-fors, both for the team that you lead as well as other teams in the building that you may observe but are not in charge of leading because you've delegated or distributed that work. And the final effort to merge this notion of a learning culture with high performance is understanding the roles that the structures you create in your building are focused in a way that addresses time and space, collective empowerment, and a communication system. So these are three categories of structures that are essential. And this is a really tight tie to the DeKalb continuous school improvement system, because we talk so much about the importance of structures and processes for deploying your strategies that you've adopted. These are the structures that are associated with high performance learning cultures, and we certainly want that as a link to your continuous school improvement system. For time and space, we talked about the fact that nobody gets more time, right? But there are ways to look at trying to create some temporary blocks of time, some just-in-time freed time through substitutes, volunteers, or staff. How can we purchase some time to allow for extra people to come using retirees, foundation funding, or compensation, creating our schedules in a way that build in common time for planning that may alternate with shorter times and longer times, restructured or rescheduled times, and that would be a permanent implementation of freed time, and then really looking at current practices of how we are currently using our time and how we might restructure our use of time. Second structure is looking at how we create collective empowerment. And that is going to happen through decision making and adoption of strategies and things like that. So collective empowerment is dependent on inclusivity, that diverse representation of empowerment. So if we're talking about a particular department or grade level, it's not just those content discipline teachers. What about the other folks who work with groups of students, like our special education faculty, our second language learning support faculty? All of that diverse groups within the community contribute to collective empowerment because we're making decisions in a way that addresses all the folks who are involved in the implementation of whatever decision has been made. We also have this notion of creating capacity for risk. That creative capacity of innovation is necessary, but can be squashed if we don't have very clear structures to allow for risks and mistakes, and also structures to align resources, both fiscal and human, to that empowering of teachers to make decisions collectively. And then the last structure is the structure of communication. And I think this is one that perhaps we need to make sure we're very clear on the power of it. A communication system can be thought as a structure that moves from cooperation to coordination and ultimately culminates with collaboration. You know, communication is more than just the simple idea of one-way or two-way communication where people are talking. Communication is rooted in the Latin communis, which means common. So communication scholars define communication as the process by which people interactively create, sustain, and manage messages in the pursuit of a common meaning. Schools, whether large or small, are complex with multiple levels of communities and groups functioning at any given time. So well-defined communication structures then influence the extent to which various individuals and groups can maintain a focus on the common meaning of their work as they manage the multitude of messages in any given day or week. So if you're thinking about how do I begin defining the communication structures that would make up an effective system, well, you may want to consider the establishment of norms that define communication for interpersonal and intra-organizational communication, right? So when we look at communication norms, those are communication patterns which are considered proper and respectful. These norms are grounded in the core values of the organization and should engender respect for the unique and diverse identities of individuals within the organization. Individual communication norms should be established school-wide and define expectations. Learned and cultural norms are part of the socialization process. Cultural norms come from our individual experience, while organizational norms are established over time. Maybe through agreements. Establishing agreements based on values, those beliefs and philosophies and principles that drive our group, is really critical. It could be that if we value and respect all individuals, that we take on a challenge to be a no gossip zone. And when we do that, we're not giving permission for individuals to look the other way if they observe gossiping or an inappropriate action, but rather the school establishes an agreement to discuss the concerns about gossiping with the appropriate individual. Often a commitment to interpersonal communication can be based on the organizational structures and ought to include a chain of communication. Now, a norm that serve as the ground rules that dictate how people interact, thinking about a chain of communication norm, that's very different than the traditional language of chain of command. Chain of command introduces a power structure that may conflict with efforts to create those structures of collective empowerment that we've talked about. Rather, a chain of communication ensures that problems can be addressed at the level closest to the individuals involved. All of this contributes to the culture, because remember, our culture is the interaction between the values and principles and philosophies that drive us and the ground rules that dictate how we interact. A chain of communication helps with clarifying individuals. In addition, when we talk about communication, the communication system is going to influence our decision-making processes. Do we have a well-defined decision-making framework in our building, or do people just not really understand how decisions are made? At the macro level, establishing clear communication about engagement in decision-making is also essential for leaders seeking to create a high-performance learning culture. Consider this 3 I's decision-making framework. Informing decisions, the first I, are those that have to be made by the senior leadership due to policy or time constraints. This is a reality in the work of school administration and leadership. And while it is necessary to move forward in these decisions without engaging others in the process, it is critical that the leader provide individuals who will be affected by the decisions with information regarding both the decision and the rationale. Input decisions, the I on the other side of the graphic, are ultimately made by the leader. However, these decisions are not as constrained by policy or time. When leaders have the discretion to engage others in providing input, it is critical that the process by which the input will be considered is clarified in advance. There are circumstances when leaders have additional factors beyond the faculty voice that must be considered in a final decision. There may be other times when the input will be reviewed to determine a majority voice. The communication structure around input decisions is critical to define for the school community how the input will be considered. And finally, the last decision, the kind that's right there in the middle of our graphic, the involving decisions, are the most complex. And these decisions require a clear communication structure and a common definition of consensus. The context for this consensus has to be established, as well as the processes to be used for individuals and groups to review pertinent information, to inquire and exchange ideas, and to consider consequences of various options. I have always defined consensus based on the little words that make up the big words. So in this flow of language, we can see that consensus includes this notion of consenting. And what is it that we're consenting to in consensus? We may not be consenting to do something that was our first choice, but we are consenting to move forward as a group because whatever decision that we're making makes sense to us. Right? It makes sense, not because it was our favorite, but it makes sense in the context of the us, meaning the organization's shared goals and vision. So consensus, defining it before you move into an involvement decision, is a critical communication structure that will need to be addressed. Again, our 3 structures, we are challenging you to identify look-fors for time and space, collective empowerment, and the communication system. For each of these structures, we challenge you to identify specific examples that you would establish for a team that you are leading, likely your leadership team. Then we want you to identify the look-fors for other teams in the building. And this was all part of our final session, virtual session in early May. Finally, I'd like to take us back and revisit our essential questions. With this focus on those look-fors and going out and looking for them to get a sense of your current reality, each of you should be equipped to guide a shift from whatever that current reality is by paying attention to the conditions, the functions, and the structures that are already in place, and using the learning from this module to identify how you can leverage existing forces in your building and identify any obstacles to change. So we've included in the resources for this module a force field analysis tool. Now, force field analysis is something that many people are familiar with, but is often done superficially. So we've included the protocol for you to achieve an effective set of structures for your high performance learning culture, an effective set of functions, and an effective set of conditions. For each of the dimensions of a high performance learning culture, we are challenging you to look at what the barriers are, the driving forces are, so that you can leverage your learning and practice to truly move forward and strengthen the existence of the high performance learning culture in your building. Your commitment will lead to action. So we've challenged each of you to build in those action plans as part of your continuous school improvement system work, as well as part of your regular day-to-day engagement with the teams in your building. The virtual deployment of this module was different than anything we expected. We will appreciate your feedback on the entire experience from January through May, and you can take a picture and of that link down there, because we'd love to hear back from you about your experiences with this module.